to Local World TV on the geopolitico.com for July 26th. Now, I apologize if my voice is a little bit raspy, but I've been at a very exciting wedding in Lebanon and just came back to Dubai. And it was in fact a multi-sectarian union between a Druze and a Sunni Shiite family. And that's actually what I want to talk to you today about, sectarianism in the Middle East. Now, why is sectarianism even relevant? Well, in fact, if you've been reading the news of the past week, you'll see that on one side of the Middle East, you have the rising tensions between a Shiite Iran and a predominantly Sunni Gulf Arab set of states. And on the other side entirely, you have rising tension between the Shiite militant group Hezbollah and the Sunni Prime Minister of Lebanon, Saad Hariri. If you want to read more about that, I'll be writing about it on my blog in the coming days. Now, this issue of sectarianism is an age-old one in the Muslim world. Now, I would belabor the point to get into all the history of sectarian tensions, conflicts, and battles in the Muslim world and in the Middle East. But I'll tell you that it goes back to the time of the Prophet's death, when there's disagreement about who was his religious successor. The Shiites, which means actually Shiat Ali or party of Ali, believed that the Prophet's cousin and close companion in battle and a number of religious affairs was appointed by the Prophet himself as his successor, and that after Ali's death, that there would be a continuing succession of imams or religious leaders for time immemorial that would lead the Muslim community. The Sunnis, who are the Al-Sunnah or people of the tradition of the Prophet essentially, don't believe that the Prophet appointed a specific religious leader, especially through Ali. And that's where the tension lies. Now, within the Shiites, you have a number of groupings, one called the Twelvers, and that believes that there were 12 imams. The 12th, called Imam Mahdi, disappeared and will return in a somewhat messianic return or Armageddon sense at some point in history. And you have other groupings within the Shiites, such as the Ismailis and the Zaydis. The Zaydis, you know them from Yemen. And the Shiites as a totality comprise maybe 10%, 15% of the global Muslim community. On the other side, you have Sunnis who constitute about 80%, and they have four predominant schools of law or jurisprudence, and that's how they're segmented. Now, that's a very simplistic representation of the Islamic global community, and I promise that I will update that at some point, but let's leave it at that with those two major groupings. Now, what has been happening recently in the Middle East? Now, after the Iraq War, Iraq being a predominantly Shiite country, about 60% of its population, which had been ruled by a socialist but ostensibly Sunni elite for a few decades under Saddam Hussein, was jolted with the invasion. And the Middle East, in fact, was shocked because all of a sudden, in the heart of the Arab world, one of the predominant countries was now being ruled by a Shiite authority, which hadn't happened in Iraq, some people say, for over 1,000 years. Now, Vali Nasser, a scholar and advisor to the US government, wrote a book called The Shiite Revival, because it wasn't just in Iraq where you had this rise, but then also in the last 10 years in Lebanon, and then Iran was playing a rising role. And so people even such as the King of Jordan, King Abdullah, started talking about a Shiite crescent from Iran and Iraq and through Lebanon that was going to challenge the existing order in the Middle East. So with these type of developments in the last 10 years, a number of flashpoints have emerged where the tension between particularly the Shiites and Sunnis in the Middle East rises to the forefront and becomes a monumental factor in conflicts, politics, and social change. Well, what are some of these? Well, you have Lebanon, for example, where you have the militant group Hezbollah, which is ostensibly there to fight Israel in a form of resistance, but it is rooted very much so in Shiite theology, and more recently has been using its militancy, its military power internally to settle domestic affairs. That is a significant flashpoint that remains unresolved, and continues to have reverberating tensions. Watch out for Lebanon in September, when the results of the Hariri Tribunal may start to be officially released and may in fact accuse Hezbollah of complicity in the assassination of the former Prime Minister of Lebanon, Rafiq al-Hariri. Then you have Iraq, which we talked about, Bahrain, there is a restive Shiite population always agitating against an autocratic emir, and there is some tension there always existing. Syria, which is led by Bashar al-Assad, who comes from the Alawi community, which is a very small minority community, sometimes considered within the Shiite grouping. But there's always an element of the population, which is predominantly Sunni, being dissatisfied with his leadership. Yemen, another flashpoint, where we recently had the battle between the Houthis, who are actually Zaydis, another grouping of the Shiites, revolting against the central government. And then probably the largest flashpoint of them all is that between Iran and the Gulf states. Now, the Gulf states are the people in the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, you could say Qatar, Bahrain. These are predominantly Sunni states. Now, I said the people of the Gulf. Well, it's really also the leadership and the people in which these tensions are finding their way. On an everyday basis, in fact, if you go to the quote-unquote Arab Street, which doesn't actually exist, I've never found it. But if you go there, people aren't worrying every day saying, oh, I really need to get the Shiites, or I really need to attack the Sunnis. But you start to have tensions, for example, when people get suspicious of minorities, small ones, even including here in the UAE or in Saudi Arabia, that might start to create tension for some of these governments which really value stability in their countries. And then further afield, you have the situation in Pakistan, where you have had rising sectarian violence in the last 6 months. Afghanistan, where the Shiites actually are outside of the main plurality, the Pashtus, which are the party of the Taliban. And we know that when the Taliban were in power, they used to persecute the Shiites, and that led to a number of massacres, and then counter-reprisal attacks, etc. So all throughout the Middle East, you have a number of flashpoints that are more latent or more active than others. Now, what does that mean for policymakers? Well, the US and regional governments need to be extremely careful as they treat geopolitical issues, to be aware of the sectarian dynamic that either is underlying some of those issues or may actually rise to the surface when there are certain tensions. Now, take a look at the situation with Iran. As the US mobilizes an alliance against Iran, it is using the old, perhaps you could say, hatred between the Sunnis and the Shiites to create a counterweight against Iran. So on one side you'd have Iran and Shiite forces, and on the other you'd have Sunni governments, Sunni populations, etc. And you foster that suspicion to be kind of a weight against each other. But that is extremely dangerous. We've seen massacres, we've seen violence that can spiral out of control when the sectarian dynamic is introduced. Well, this is a long edition of Local World TV today, but I hope you found it worthwhile. And join us next time for Local World TV right here on the geopolitico.com. Always remember, globalize your mind.